I'm Brian Scordato, and this is the Idea to Startup podcast, a podcast that's been called, quote, easily 10 times more useful than my MBA, which probably says more about higher education than our pod, but it was a nice review. We're going to start sending the pod along with some deeper content each week, so if you're a power listener of Idea to Startup, head to gettacklebox.beehive.com or the link in the show notes. Beehive is spelled a bit wildly, so it's gettacklebox.beehive.com. On to it. Today, we're going to help you surprise yourself to do things you didn't think you could. And we'll do it by digging in on my favorite item from the Always Work and Never Work lists we talked about a few weeks back. If you didn't listen to that episode, or to jog your memory, the Always Work and Never Work lists are exactly what they sound like. Two lists I've compiled over the past decade or so of working with founders, running my business, and living my life. One has things that always work, and the other has things that never work. The items on the Always Work list are things like, quote, a super healthy meal after an unhealthy one to break momentum, or 1 hour of reflective journaling in a coffee shop with no electronics, and make a list of the 5 things the best CEO in the world would do on day one if they took over your business. Conversely, the Never Work list has things like, quote, looking at engagement statistics when I don't need them for an immediate decision, and adding something to my life without subtracting something else. There are dozens of items on each list. For a while, I just haphazardly added things that worked and things that didn't as they smacked me in the face. But now the lists and the process are pretty structured. I've got tags for problems I run into regularly, things like lack of momentum or prioritization or unsure of my North Star, that I attach to the things that never work and the things that always work in those situations. And since I'm an even bigger dork than you thought, I've got journal entries under a bunch of these problem categories. So I can go back and see that in 2017, I was struggling with the direction of Tacklebox. I'd lost my North Star. I've got a brief rundown of what I tried, what worked, and suggestions for the next time I'm feeling like that. The reason these lists are so effective is because I'm a human. I think every situation is new, even though it usually rhymes pretty strongly with something that's happened before. I just need to remind myself to remove myself from the situation and see what it actually calls for objectively, and the lists help. I think of these lists as my personal operating manual. If this happens, do this. A way to remove unhelpful emotions. Anyway, the episode on Always Work and Never Work lists got a bunch of traction and emails, so I'm figuring out the best way to make it accessible for whoever would like to see it. Email team@gettacklebox.com with the subject, quote, Always Work, Never Work, if you'd like them once I figure it out. If you didn't listen, I'll pop the episode in the show notes. Today's episode will focus on one of those emails I got after that episode. It came from a guy who seemed to be doing his best Gary V/cartoon villain impression, and his email read, quote, I definitely don't have time to listen to all 25 minutes of that episode, but could you please summarize it in one bullet point and respond to this email with that summary? I actually started getting ready to summarize the post before I realized, hey, I don't even work for this guy, and the podcast is free. So I drafted a response telling him to go step on Legos barefoot, but then I deleted that email because I realized his email actually had a question I loved. And it led to about 10 hours of me digging through that episode and through the lists and through the database of our founders and the blockers that they hit. What came out the other side was this episode, the single most useful item from the Always Work and Never Work lists for early stage entrepreneurs. The reason I chose this one is happiness, specifically your happiness. A year or two ago, I spoke with a happiness expert in preparation for a podcast series we never actually ended up airing. The whole thing was fascinating, but her description of happiness is a thing that has always stuck with me. Happiness, she said, is when you surprise yourself. She continued, it's when you do something that you didn't think you could. Think about the happiest moments in your life, when you propose and someone says yes, when you have a kid, when you score the winning goal, when you get accepted into a prestigious place. You're always doing something that's past what you'd expected for yourself. The harder you work for that thing, the happier you are. She went on, happiness is the difference between expectation and reality. So the formula is to first lower your expectations and then second, to figure out ways to beat those expectations. As I said, this definition has stuck with me, and eventually, I think it was because I decided that a piece of the equation was missing. You have to put yourself in the situations where the outcome has the potential to surprise you in the first place, where you're doing something you maybe don't believe you can do. This means lofty goals and a system for reaching them, which most people don't have. In 2018, I ran the New York City Marathon. Before it, I'd never run more than 6 miles, but I vividly remember the sign that said 1 mile left. I'd hit the bottom loop of the Central Park path. There were thousands of screaming fans, and I realized I was going to finish. And I cried like a baby, which surprised the hell out of me, but I couldn't stop. I was just so happy because running 26.2 miles in a row was unexpected. And I'd worked really hard to be able to do it. And that made me happy. And so I cried. And then someone from the crowd looked me dead in the eyes and screamed, "Hey, stop crying and finish the damn race. Christ." I love New York so much. Maybe not coincidentally, the always work and never work list started while I was training for that race because I needed to get an output that I wouldn't get from normal inputs. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The answer to the question posed by our fake Gary V, my favorite item from the always work list, the one that sets you up to surprise yourself, the Daniel Tiger SOP. And yes, if you've got a toddler, it's named after that Daniel Tiger. And we'll get to it with a few examples of our founders using it to surprise themselves after a little smooth jazz. If you've got a startup idea and a full-time job and want to test out the former before you leave the latter, come and work with us. Apply at gettacklebox.com. Over 400 startups have tested and built ideas through our program, and those businesses are now collectively worth over $1 billion. Our program helps you prioritize and execute, and our members and me and the team keep you accountable and give you feedback along the way. Come build with us at gettacklebox.com. You'll probably never sprint again. If you're over the age of 30, and according to my podcast listener data, that's a decent chunk of you, there's statistically a 90% chance that you will never sprint again. Not like run a design sprint, like actually throw on some sneakers and run as fast as you can in a big field. Which is a joke in my house right now because the little guy seemingly hasn't learned to walk. I've only seen him sprint. He sprints to Ruby in the morning and to the door when someone knocks and then circles around the kitchen chanting waffle while his breakfast heats up in the toaster. About 40% of the time, he ends up tripping during the sprint and tumbling across the floor like those old Charlie Brown dust clouds with feet and hands sticking out in every direction, but he doesn't seem to mind. He pops back up and he sprints again. But at some point, apparently when he's 30, that will stop. The older we get, the deeper the ruts in the road that we drive our wagon on get. And getting out of those ruts gets harder. Now, I don't really care if you ever sprint again, but I do need you to have a system to get out of those ruts, because the only word that matters for a startup is different. How meaningfully, obviously, purposefully, usefully different are you? Different is the goal. And different doesn't come from the path everyone takes. It comes from doing something new. And new is scary. Which brings us to the Daniel Tiger SOP. If you don't know, SOP stands for Standard Operating Procedure, and we use them a ton at Tacklebox. The basic idea is to create a clear procedure for situations you want to standardize. Startups require you to do an enormous number of things, and removing thought from the ones that don't need thought is critical. We have two types of SOPs at Tacklebox: repetitive SOPs and uncomfortable SOPs. We'll start with an example of repetitive SOPs. When you start getting emails from customers, it might not be the best use of your time to think up a response from scratch for each. So you can craft an SOP while answering the first 50 or so. Then you hand that SOP off to someone else or you automate it. The SOP has steps as to how you answer these emails. Repetitive SOPs exist to create sound process that gets something off your plate. The other type of SOP exists to make sure you don't respond to uncomfortable situations with your instincts. Your instincts will always be to avoid discomfort, but the path to different comes from leaning into discomfort, quickly and repeatedly. The cold water doesn't get warmer if you jump late. The aggregate of the repetitive SOPs and uncomfortable SOPs then becomes your business, the systems that scale, and the approach to problems. The Daniel Tiger SOP helps you navigate uncomfortable situations, and it comes from a show my son watches called Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. It's a cartoon that has one or two core lessons each episode that they make songs out of. My favorite song is called, quote, "When we do something new, let's talk about what we'll do." Whenever Daniel has to do something new, like go to the dentist, they sing the song and talk about exactly what's going to happen. The dentist as a concept is very scary, but broken down, you just get in the car, drive to the dentist, park, walk in, wait in the waiting room, go into the dentist room, sit in the chair, open your mouth, get your teeth cleaned for 5 minutes with a water squirter, and then you go home. It seems totally manageable when it's broken down that way. The Daniel Tiger SOP exists to do the same for entrepreneurs. It consists of a stack of 8 questions I'm going to read now, then we'll show you how they work in practice. Here are the questions. First, what do you want to do? Second, what's uncomfortable about it? Third, walk through the individual steps you'd have to take to make this happen. Fourth, what's the worst case? Fifth, is the worst case actually harmful or just uncomfortable? Sixth, what's the absolute best case? 7, does the best case seem way better than the worst case? And 8, what's the smallest first step you can take and when can you take it? If you want this list without pausing and frantically writing it down in your notes app, head to gettacklebox.beehiiv.com to get the emails with episode details each week. Okay, let's dig in. Email scam detectors for boomers. A podcast listener reached out the other day and mentioned that they'd had an idea after their parents had been scammed online. Basically, their parents had received an email that looked like it was from their bank that said they'd been hacked and needed to reset their password. Our listeners' parents went to a site that looked exactly like their bank site, then proceeded to make a new password that immediately got stolen, and the hackers took a big chunk of their retirement savings. This has become a bit of an epidemic. U.S. residents lost more than $4.6 billion to scams in 2023, and lots of scams go unreported, so that number is probably a lot higher, and it's growing. The founder wanted to make AI software that sat on top of people's email and scanned for possible scams. It'd have an up-to-date library of current scams and could tag the emails or even just delete the ones altogether that seemed fishy. She was a listener of the pod, and she knew she needed to speak with customers, but she'd been stuck at that step for weeks. She just couldn't make herself do it. It just seemed so uncomfortable to talk to a bunch of folks about how they were ripe to be scammed. She said it seemed a bit, quote, presumptive and maybe even cruel. So her plan was to just avoid speaking with customers and launch without it. This is the perfect scenario for the Daniel Tiger SOP. We hopped on a quick call so I could walk her through the 8 questions. Here were her responses. First, what do you want to do? Reach out to my customers, she said, specifically people over 65, and learn how they think about and protect against scams now. Question 2, what's uncomfortable about it? I don't really know how to reach out to these people without seeming insulting. I also don't really know how to find them, and it just seems uncomfortable talking to them. I can't really tell you more than that's just how it feels. Number 3. Okay, let's walk through the individual steps you'd have to take to make this happen. She paused for a moment here because she'd been stuck on the idea that it'd be uncomfortable and hadn't really gotten into what would actually happen before. Well, she said, I guess I'd have to figure out the best way to get in touch with these people. So maybe I'd start by emailing a group of my friends and seeing if they'd connect me to their parents. So the steps would be 1, create a list of my closest 25 friends. 2, write an email asking to speak with their parents about a startup idea I was working on. 3, create a Calendly link for them to schedule time with me. 4, create a list of questions. 5, then just have the calls, I guess, over a couple of weeks. My question number 4, what's the worst case scenario? She waited for a second and said, I guess that no one wants to speak with me? Or maybe this isn't a problem they think about, which is something I'd really want to know anyway, I guess. So there isn't really a worst case. Question number 5. Is that worst case actually harmful or just potentially uncomfortable? She laughed. Potentially just kind of uncomfortable. Question 6. What is the absolute best case? I guess that I learn how they think about scammers and I get a bunch of first customers that I can start running tests with. Number 7. Does the best case seem way better than the worst case? Yes, of course. I could have customers immediately. And question 8. What's the small first step and when can you do it? She responded by saying, I can create a list and write the email, and I can do it tonight after dinner. And that is that, the Daniel Tiger SOP. The key points are to walk through exactly what will happen to show yourself that the worst case scenario isn't bad at all and the best case scenario is likely transformative. Humans instinctively protect downside and ignore upside. We need to fix that, but It is in our nature. Now, if you haven't started a startup before, this might seem really silly to you. She should just speak with her customers, right? Well, ask anyone who started a business how many times they run into scenarios where they are functionally frozen. They're unable to do what they know they should do because it's new, and new is uncomfortable, and so many things are new, so many things are uncomfortable, and it just gets overwhelming. And in case you were wondering, our founder then sent this email, had 20 conversations, and realized their real customers were the adult kids. And the inflection point was after those kids' parents had been hacked or had a close call. Change only comes after pain. So, marketing directly to the kids with language like, quote, your parents were scammed and you want to make sure it never happens again, got lots of signups. The kids were always the ones who installed the software or signed into iCloud anyway, so they wanted to manage the software for their parents. The company is humming along mid-concierge test. In the past month, we've had founders use the Daniel Tiger SOP to reach out to a dozen manufacturers to learn about the viability of a new deck umbrella, to speak to 25 scientists to learn more about the best approach for sustainable commercial fishing, and to execute a concierge MVP that helped restaurants source local produce. When I run into something that my instincts immediately push me away from, I now say, let's Daniel Tiger this, and I run through the 8 prompts. It is magic. Mostly because our brains are dumb, which brings us to the end. The end. Our brains are dumb. For how smart we are, our brains are really dumb. There are 2 reasons this is wildly helpful for you. First, our brains love those well-worn ruts we talked about, the known path that everyone else is on. Our brain's first instinct in every scenario will always be to move away from discomfort. If you stick with this first instinct as an entrepreneur, you'll never get anywhere interesting. So the origination of the always work list for me was to find things that always worked to get me out of that well-worn rut, to move towards discomfort so that I could get somewhere interesting, but to do it in a way that's tolerable. It's Graham Weaver's idea that everything worth doing will make things worse first before they get better. They'll start as hard and uncomfortable, then lead you somewhere interesting. This isn't in our nature, so you've got to bring in a system to do it. Which means that our brains being dumb in that they'll always push us away from discomfort actually gives people who can navigate that an advantage. The second reason our brains being dumb is helpful to you is because they're really easy to trick. There is a great Nate Bargatze bit I'll pop in the show notes about how dumb our brains are. He talks about how if you're in a bad mood, you can just fake smile and your brain immediately thinks you're having a good day, even though it's in on the trick. The takeaway is you can trick your brain. If your consistent reaction to something uncomfortable is to toss it into the Daniel Tiger SOP framework to tease it out and make it less intimidating, that'll start to be your default reaction. It won't be to shy away. It'll be to figure out how to make a seemingly uncomfortable thing comfortable, to make it much easier to get out of the rut, to sprint again, which just entails throwing on your shoes, heading to the track, warming up, then sprinting for a while, and realizing that the downside is you might look a little silly, and the upside is there's no better feeling in the world than sprinting. Just ask my son. This was the Idea to Startup podcast brought to you by Tacklebox. If you've got a startup idea and a full-time job, head to gettacklebox.com and apply. We'll get back to you in 72 hours and we can be working together on your idea by the weekend. Have a great week.